think that's what from both of us. So practice. Just academics with discussing things in our academic way, conscious. I don't see it.
Yeah.
So it's something else that probably a few people read text and
Even if it is, it's still like self-disheartening.
or did you say
It's still I did all questions too. I think it's I started with two. Yeah. I have all questions.
This event that we've been looking forward to for a long time. I'm Steen Halling, and I teach in the graduate psychology program. And we're delighted to have Enrico Gnaulati here, who's being very generous in not only coming, but his book, the proceeds from the book, if you buy a copy of his book tonight, it'll go to the nonprofit Psychotherapy Cooperative, which provides therapy for low-income folks. So it's a bit like buying ice cream and eating it all and knowing there are no calories. So that kind of comparison. I mean, okay, I'll say a little bit more about the book in a moment. We have two sponsors. Neither of them are corporate sponsors, but they're like real organizations and people. Dr. Randy Horton, who's the director of the graduate program. And my favorite president, Kristen Beck, who's president of the Psychotherapy Cooperative. Bathrooms are outside and to your right and then to the left. They also have showers. It's only for commuter students. The bathrooms have okay. So, after the presentation, Rico will be happy to sign copies of the books if you want to buy a copy. It's wonderful to have you back here. Rico graduated from Seattle University in 1987 for the master's program. Then he went to Columbia, got his Ph.D. And then he has been in private practice in California, Pasadena, for a number of years. Now he's doing something that's really unusual for full-time clinicians. He's written 3 books. And this is the latest, Semi-Talk Therapy. They're all eminently readable. He does great research, he draws on his clinical experience, and the one thing he does, I'm not quite sure how he does it, I think he actually should give a workshop on how to make psychology read really well. He's a very good writer. And when I started reading this book, I thought, well, it's probably be a little hard to get through. Because it's about psychology and all of that stuff in Freud. And I found myself losing track of time. And he has a knack for storytelling and for doing research and presenting such a way that is compelling. He has gotten a lot of wonderful reviews for this book as well as previous books. And he's been interviewed on public radio, he's been interviewed on Al Jazeera. His work and the mission he's on has been publicized across this country and Canada and a couple of international places. He is speaking on behalf of the value of in-depth psychotherapy and really making the argument that what we've been told about cognitive behavioral therapy and short-term therapy and pharmaceutical treatments, while they may not be altogether wrong, they're rather exaggerated. In other words, that there is a solidity to psychotherapy that we need to be reminded of. Okay. And thank you to Adria, who has volunteered to do the filming. And that camera over there will capture this for event for history. All right. Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you so much, Rico, for giving your time. He's giving not only his book, but his time for today and tomorrow. We're really grateful for your
Thanks, Dean. That means the world to me, actually. Just what you said about me as a writer, coming from you, really means a great deal. I remember seeing redlining a lot of my papers back in the day when I was not such a good writer. So maybe you get some credit for giving me the kind of corrective feedback that I needed. Anyway, so it's a great honor for me to return to my alma mater here. You know, I was a student, as Steve mentioned, in 1985. It's sort of an iconic story. I remember I knew nothing about the program. I was an undergrad at Cal State Fullerton down in Southern California, and I was getting my degree in American Studies with a minor in philosophy. And I had some exposure to existential thought in the philosophy department down there. And then they had a conference, this would have been maybe 1984, 1983. It was called the Psychoanalysis and the Self. And the keynote speaker was Robert Stolbrough, who had just released a book called Structures of Subjectivity. And I was on a student panel responding to him and just devoured that book and just got my interest going in existential phenomenology, didn't know what it was, got my hands on that publication that the American Psychological Association puts out with all the graduate schools in psychology. Naively thinking that there were abundance of programs out there that, you know, were favorable and friendly towards an existential position, and discovered that there were very few of them, one being Seattle U. So I remember I was broke in those days. I remember getting on an Amtrak train at Union Station in Los Angeles, taking the train all the way to Seattle, staying in like a flop house downtown, like in a room that was about the size of an average-sized closet, where you had to kind of put furniture up against the door or something, you know, unforgettably unpleasant, you know, might happen. Literally spent the night, came to on campus here when the psychology department was in a tiny little red brick building over here. I remember walking down the creaky hardwood floor stairs, and there was, you know, faculty there with their doors open, actually there during office hours, and not just there in the flesh, but there in terms of their attentiveness. Sorry. But I remember as a young man, just the feel of walking into that building and having people like George and Steve and Wayne Berber and Jan Rowe there, who were not just there to kind of disseminate information about the program, but they were there to like really embody what the program represented. And so I made a decision that day that I was going to apply within 2 or 3 months. Sort of a post-60s story. I put everything I owned in a VW van and drove up here from LA and started the program. And so the book that I wrote, Saving Talk Therapy, is really, I was on a mission to preserve the preciousness of the psychotherapeutic enterprise that I was exposed to here at Seattle University over 30 years ago. I think the older I get, I'm much more firmly in the existential phenomenological camp in terms of how I think and practice as a therapist. I made major forays into the psychoanalytic tradition over the years at Columbia, where I got my Ph.D. in clinical psychology, where most of my supervisors and faculty there were affiliated with the William Allison White Institute and the NYU postdoc program there. There was still an existential sort of relational bent there, but I've come around and I'm much more influenced these days by existential humanistic thinkers. And Steen, you were prescient many years ago. You may still say this to students in your class, but I remember you saying that regardless of one's stripe as a therapist, regardless of the paradigm that you associate with in the field, as therapists mature, they become de facto phenomenologists. I remember you saying that, and that has occurred to me, and what I take that to mean is effective psychotherapy requires a psychotherapist that he or she be present to and work from within the client-shifting subjective experience. But I get ahead of myself here. I don't want to launch into quite yet a discussion of what constitutes good psychotherapy. I'll get to that in a little bit here. But first I'm going to talk a little bit, sort of get into the meat of some of the arguments that I get into in this book. What I'm proposing in this book is that talk therapy is in decline. It used to be that when you said you're going into therapy, that it meant something. It was like a quasi-spiritual, transformative odyssey that you were about to embark on. These days, people are more likely to seek out mental health interventions than go into talk therapy per se. By that I mean, take a vow of honesty, be candid, open, peel back the defenses, take a kind of a long, hard look inside yourself to see what's going on. That is in decline. And let me make several arguments about where the evidence lies to substantiate that claim. So, even though with the state and federal parity laws focused on covering mental health, equitable to medical health issues, there's been maybe an improvement in access to mental health care, but really there's a lot, we've lost the plot when it comes to, I would say, the quality and amount of psychotherapy that's available out there. There's been about a 20% decline in the average number of psychotherapy visits that people get. Used to be, over the past decade, 10, 15 years, average used to be about 10 sessions. It currently is about 8. And believe it or not, about 40% of people drop out of therapy within the first 1 or 2 sessions. Only about 9% of people will stay in therapy for about 20 sessions or longer, right? Now that begs the question, like, how long does therapy have to last in order to be effective? If you take a hard look at the data, 20 sessions is about the benchmark number of sessions, conservatively speaking, for there to be adequate, meaningful, and lasting change. There's some great studies out there that are starting to crop up in reaction to the juggernaut of short-term solution-focused treatments that are getting all the press these days. There's some great studies showing up. One of my favorites is the Tavistock Adult Depression Study, that looking at the benefits of long-term, in-depth psychotherapy, in this case, psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy. So in that study of protracted depression, after about a 1.5 years of therapy, 18 months of weekly psychotherapy, there were about 40% of subjects in the study no longer met the criteria for major depressive disorder, compared to 10% that got treatment as usual, which is cognitive behavioral therapy or meds, right? So it's the first randomized controlled study of its type to really zero in on the benefits of long-term therapy. There are other ones. There of course, the one that stood the test of time is the Consumer Reports study that was a godsend to those of us that were entering the field back in the late 80s, early 90s, when managed care, the ravages of managed care and the introduction of Prozac on the scene took over, and we were all worried about surviving as therapists, and then this Consumer Reports study came out, spearheaded by Martin Seligman, that basically showed a dose response curve to psychotherapy. The more you have of it, the better you get. And in that study, and it was a huge survey of Americans that was sort of tacked on to a Consumer Reports survey, and that showed that about 2 years of therapy was required for people to have changes in their sort of meaningful change, like changes in their emotional well-being, changes in their kind of relational versatility, changes in their capacity, frankly, to love, and be loved, and have productive work lives. There are others. There's the Helsinki psychotherapy study. There's a study out of McGill University. It's a great study on looking at people with difficult personality traits that shows that it takes about a year and a half of in-depth therapy for people to kind of shed basic defenses like avoidance and denial and whatnot. There's a great study by Drew Weston out of Emory University who surveyed therapists from across various traditions about how long they thought it took for the average anxious and depressed client to achieve lasting change. And once again, it's back to this, about a year and a half of therapy. So if you hold that as the realistic benchmark about how much therapy people really need to get better, we have a huge, unrecognized psychotherapy dropout crisis in the country right now. Because, once again, the average number of sessions people are getting are about 8, and the vast majority of people are getting far less than that. And actually, if you look at some of these so-called authoritative treatments, the new evidence-based treatments that are just permeating the field right now, the dropout rates are horrendous. So I have an article that's coming out in January or early next year in the journal Psychotherapy. Psychotherapy Theory, Research, Practice, and Training. It's the main APA journal on psychotherapy. I was asked to write an article that was critical of the APA-approved treatments for PTSD. One of them is called cognitive processing therapy. The other one is called prolonged exposure therapy. These are the only 2 treatments that the APA basically has authorized for the treatment of PTSD. They're like 12-week-long, manualized, formulaic therapies. The dropout rates are horrible. So in the Veterans Affairs Administration, in the treatment where they're really disseminating these treatments and heavily implementing them, there are studies that I've uncovered that said that only 2% of clients will stick with therapy, another 8%. You're getting these huge dropouts, anywhere between like 90% and 60% of treatments that last 8 to 16 weeks. And there's a focus on them. The explanations given for that is that, PTSD clients are difficult to treat. They get triggered, they're avoided, and so any treatment that tries to sort of confront them with trauma is going to naturally lead to dropout. There's no real questioning of the quality of treatment that's provided. And in the article that I'm writing, I basically say that these treatments are unethical to be promoting and practicing. So we've got a fairly distinct psychotherapy dropout problem, I would say. And is that because psychotherapy is unpopular these days? I would say no, it's actually very popular. So if you look at surveys, about anywhere between 75% and 90% of people would prefer to talk to a professional about their problems rather than take medication. Yet about 60% of people will be on meds without any ancillary talk therapy. Meds aren't as popular as you would think. About a third of people don't refill prescriptions of antidepressant medication. And in my experience, I don't know what your experience is like, people who, it's often a devil's choice, weighing the pros and cons of side effects and therapeutic benefits of medication. So we have a situation, I would say, where we've got this horrendous psychotherapy dropout problem. We've got people are kind of not getting the psychotherapy they need. The quality of that psychotherapy is deteriorating. I'll get into that in a minute. Why is this happening? And I'm just going to basically summarize some of the arguments that I make in my book. Part of it is, probably I would say the number one reason for the declining availability of quality talk therapy has to do with the marketing success of Prozac in the late 80s and early 90s. Prozac was marketed purposefully and strategically as a safe alternative to the previous generation of antidepressant medications, the tricyclics, imipramine, zipramine. Those were highly lethal medications. You could swallow a handful of those and be dead. You can swallow upwards of 300 Prozac and just have a tummy ache. And Eli Lilly caught on to that, and so therefore marketed Prozac to primary care physicians, not psychiatrists. And so now, the vast majority of prescribing psychotropic medications is done by non-psychiatrist physicians in the country right now, like upwards of 80%. So non-psychiatrist physicians have now become frontline mental health providers in a way that was not the case going back 20 or 30 years. It used to be the case that when you went to see your family physician, your primary care physician, and you broke down crying and related some mental health problem, you would get a referral to a psychotherapist. Now that person will take out the prescription pad and write a prescription for you. So that's probably, I would say, the number one reason for the declining availability of mental health care, quality psychotherapy. And then, after Prozac, there was a much more expansive focus on pharmaceutical solutions to psychological problems. Medications, I think, are being over-promoted, over-prescribed. But there's an emerging literature questioning their effectiveness. Great book, if you haven't read it, I think we all should read The Emperor's New Drugs by Urban Kirsch. If you haven't read it, you should read it. He went out and used the Freedom of Information Act, which had to be utilized to get at all the discarded studies by pharmaceutical companies that had negative results or neutral results, so that they could run the numbers with more realistic conclusions. And in that book, he basically argued that the SSRIs are really no more effective than placebos. So another reason for the declining availability of quality talk therapy is the overpromotion, overprescribing of pharmaceuticals. Another one is the underfunding of psychotherapy by health insurers. Reimbursement rates for psychotherapy have remained flat or been in decline for over 30 years, more than that. The reimbursement rates right now by health insurers are about what they were in the 1980s. What health insurers do is they use Medicare benchmark amounts to gauge what the numbers they'll use to reimburse psychotherapy. Right now it's about $80 a session for psychologists, and that's what it was in the 1980s. And health insurers know that there's an oversupply of mental health professionals out there, and that there's a steady stream of influx of beginning psychotherapists that will fill provider lists, and that will, for a while, make do with lower reimbursement rates and all the red tape you have to go through to get reimbursed as a psychotherapist. Health insurers know this. And so what happens is it creates a lot of red tape and hoop jumping for clients, calling to see if they can get someone in network to provide psychotherapy for them. Oftentimes these provider networks are phantom networks. They are filled with lists of therapists that are not updated, and so they look bigger than they actually are. That makes the health insurers look good on paper. Basically what it does is it wears clients down. They can't find a therapist in network. They can't find an experienced therapist in network. They end up just either paying out of pocket, which then creates disincentives for them to get the amount of therapy that they need. Health insurers also reject mental health plans about twice the rate of medical health claims, more red tape. So what it does is that we've got a system that really is set up to discourage clients from sort of persisting and they give up, pay out of pocket, or just don't get therapy at all, or get an inadequate amount. The next argument I make is that that part of the reason for the psychotherapy dropout problem has to do with the new focus on evidence-based treatments in graduate schools around the country and training sites that really privilege and favor these short-term directive, technique-oriented, protocol, manualized treatments. That one of the offshoots of that is it really under-educates and under-trains and under-prepares them in as regards the clinical relationship building skills necessary to enable psychotherapy to get off the ground and take hold. So and I'll talk about this tomorrow during my workshop, what you get is a plethora, essentially, of failures of engagement. To use Buber, and I will elaborate on this tomorrow, there's an I-it ethic of care that's manifested that is alienating, and there's a failure to engage clients at a critically important time in terms of their emotional breakdown, which once again, I think has ethical ramifications to it. But that's, so many clients are deprived of the real engagement and genuine concern that's necessary to make psychotherapy appear to them as a worthwhile venture. And that, I think, has to do with this new emphasis in graduate schools and clinical training sites on these evidence-based treatments that essentially undervalue the relational dimension of good psychotherapy. I'm fond of quoting one of the founders of this cognitive processing therapy. It's like one of my favorite therapies to go after, and I do it in the 2 articles that I write and in my book also, and I've done it on the radio. Is that, if you look at, and I've gone through these manuals with a fine-tooth comb, just plucking out what are, it's like shooting fish in a barrel, just finding just deplorable examples of dehumanized care and a lack of focus on, rapport building, relationship building. And in the manual, one of the founders basically says that is it important to build a relationship with a client before you get into trauma work? And she says, no. All that does is send a message to the client that you're just reinforcing their avoidance. You're treating them like a snowflake, essentially, assuming that they're not ready to kind of do the work. And there is a kind of almost a dismissiveness in these evidence-based treatments towards relational ways of working. Anyway, so this all begs the question, how are we to define quality talk therapy that I'm claiming is in decline? And I'll just sort of, I think I've still got maybe about 30 more minutes? Okay, so I'm going to move fast here, so that we have time for Q&A. And I will be elaborating in great detail on all of this during the workshop tomorrow. So by quality talk therapy, what I mean by this is that clients are given ample time to talk at length about what ails them in their lives. They're urged to be as candid as possible, to take a sort of vow of honesty, to think the unthinkable, feel the unfeelable, and say the unsayable. So it's expected that the client's story will be told and retold in a scattershot, non-linear way, because troublesome and troubling life experiences can't be narrated with a clean and concise beginning, middle, and end. Jumping around is necessary for core issues to jump out. There's no shame in repeating oneself, because each retelling of an event often unloosens new emotions and sharpens essential realizations. Clients confidently expect they will be listened to and sensitively responded to from within the flow of their subjective experience, which engenders real trust and safety, thereby awakening long since foreclosed memories, desires, grievances, and aspirations. Emotional truth-telling is at the heart of quality talk therapy. Freud, if you read Freud carefully, he was a great believer in doing away with pretense, even though, of course, his brand of psychoanalysis was an intellectualized endeavor. He was, if you really read accounts by clients of his, and I get into it in the book, he was a punchy, naysayer, kind of grumpy, sort of wanting to tear the Band-Aid off, get to the bottom of things. Like really, pretense was the enemy. And so emotional truth-telling, at least conceptually so, I think was valuable to him, and I think is a valuable part of good therapy. But emotional truth-telling on the part of the client is maximized insofar as there's a confident expectation of emotional truth listening on the part of the therapist. If there's subtle, tacit, in good therapy, I think there's subtle, tacit, intersubjective testing and retesting going on. Can this therapist bear my unbearable affect? Is he or she too affected or too unaffected? And I will, George, talk about the face, the role of the face in all of that, and facial dialogue. Does he or she seem to go on liking me when I am seemingly at my most insufferable? More than just suffers me when I'm at my most insufferable. Receptivity on the part of the therapist can be as basic as whether a familiarity with grief, rage, lust, pride, envy, disgust, and other primal emotions is inscribed onto the therapist's face, etched into his or her face, physiognomically registered, tacitly inviting the client to share emotions that the therapist non-verbally conveys intimate familiarity with. The therapist's facial expressions, posture, voice cadence, speech prosody, all tacitly invite or disinvite the client to push the boundaries of emotional truth-telling. Therapists in good therapy, good psychotherapy, I would argue, mostly speak when they have something meaningful or moving to say. Therapists know in their bones to be patient, that something meaningful or moving to say will occur when the time is right and when the emotional conditions in the room are right. The anxiety associated with being productive, being busy, being clever, being efficient, earning your fee is like an old friend who can be said no to. Being productive is probably, I would say, the most prevalent form of countertransference right now going on by beginning therapists. I always have at least one psychological assistant working for me, and the anxiety coming out of grad school about being productive, being effective, moving the client forward, giving them tools. Gosh, if I hear another therapist, a client ask me for tools, I'm going to bop them over the head with a mallet. I get really sarcastic and therapeutic ways with clients that ask me for tools. Ask me that question tomorrow and I'll tell you some of the answers that I get. One of them is, yeah, we're going to tool around with your emotions. So, the therapist, so in good therapy, I think the therapist is poised to not only encounter the client, track, match, and recognize the client's shifting emotions and incipient realizations, but counter him or her. Not only face the client, but be prepared to face off with him or her. Client-centered therapists, like child-centered parents, lose credibility if their expressions of compassion, support are staid and overly predictable. I'm not fond of what I call postured empathy. I'll talk about that tomorrow. Clients don't want a cheerleader, a sphinx, or a sidekick for a therapist. They want a flesh and blood person who can call them out when necessary for bloodying themselves or others. Invariably, the issue is not whether to confront clients when their base self trips up their better self, but when they get stuck behaving egregiously or stuck selling themselves short, but when and how. The analyst, in the words of Adam Phillips, the prolific British psychoanalyst, or psychoanalytic essayist, as he says, has to be tenacious without being authoritarian when it comes to calling out clients for their uncalled for behavior. In good therapy, I would argue, it's normative for clients to not medicalize their disclosures, not to talk about their problems in terms of symptoms, but in everyday human and existential terms, like feeling trapped in a loveless marriage, being a highly successful professional, but yet feeling like an incompetent imposter, loving one's daughter, yet not liking her as a person, or believing you prematurely committed to a deadening career to please your parents, and now you're locked in because there's a mortgage to be paid and kids to feed. Good psychotherapists, I say, resist the systemic pressures to truncate and reconfigure the client's existential concerns into medicalized symptoms for accountability and remunerative reasons. Ultimately, what makes good psychotherapy so personally liberating, yet relationally beneficial at the same time, is that crude, unformed, but honest iterations get expressed and re-expressed in the perennial struggle to communicate candidly yet sensitively. I always shudder when someone says, well, I want to be brutally honest. Because when you're being brutally honest, you're still being a brute, right? As if somehow or other that's a virtue, to be brutally honest. Our current president is, often brutally honest, and I think that's the problem. Brutally honest. So in good therapy, we invite our clients to regress, to take the lid off the id, to let feelings fly, to call it as they see it, to reclaim their subjective voice that has been perhaps muted by compulsive social nicety. However, mature selfhood requires that social nicety never thoroughgoingly be abandoned. What Freud and the Neo-Freudians, and I get into this in the book, taught us is that if we are too good at being good, paradoxically we set ourselves up to feel and act badly. And if we're too good at being good, we can be falsely nice and nicely false, having acquired an over-socialized false self. Compulsive niceness may be a recipe for personal insecurity, but knee-jerk candidness can wreak havoc on our interpersonal relationships and leave us being more lonely than we want to be. Diplomacy, I think, always involves self-control. Freud knew this. I think Freud was a big believer in not psychoanalysis being an enterprise that moves a person in the direction of self-liberation, but more like self-domination. You have opportunities in psychoanalysis to let the demons be known, to be expressive, to let darker emotions out, to have some familiarity with your demonic self, but so that you can better control it, right? It's interesting as I've evolved as a therapist over the years, especially working with children raised with permissive parents, how much you actually have to get them to control themselves more. That therapy is a form of, really instructive sublimation. I can't tell you the number of times I've said to kids, hey, It's okay to think that, it's not okay to say it, right? That's sort of like counterintuitive. We're supposed to be helping people express themselves more, to be unrepressed. But sometimes good therapy moves people in the direction of being better at repressing themselves, at suppressing their emotions, at holding back. Let's see, do I have time? I don't. I'm gonna cut some things out, guys. You'll have to come tomorrow to get the unexpurging. What's the word? You're more literate than I am. The unexpurgated. What's the what? See, he doesn't know the word either. Anyway, so what I was going to say in greater detail, though, is I'm a big believer in good psychotherapy resulting in better expressive mastery of primal emotion, and that's one route to a stronger sense of personal agency. I'll get into that in great detail tomorrow. But good psychotherapy, I would say, also in the legacy of Freud, Rogers, R.D. Laing, is always subversive in that it frames psychological afflictions in terms of over-accommodation to pretense and mystification. It compels us to take a close look at how we deceive ourselves and where or are deceived by others, examine the delusions that we somehow feel obligated to live by to preserve the status quo in our lives. In order for psychotherapy's subversive benefits to be realized, psychotherapists need to be exquisitely attuned to clients' muted emotions, to draw them out emotionally in potentially destabilizing, though ultimately revitalizing ways. Sometimes falling ill is a prerequisite for getting well, right? Good psychotherapists, I think, are not intimidated by the regressive experience, right? It's scary to be in the presence of someone who's experiencing an emotional breakdown. I have a client right now who, 29-year-old man, who could be, you know, as a classic high-functioning pleaser. He's, you know, lived a life of an unexamined life of overachievement, went to the best of private schools, excelled, went to Stanford, ended up at Columbia, got his MBA, worked on Wall Street, pursued wealth, vanity, all those aspects of our capitalist culture that were supposed to promise happiness. And at age 29, he got to work one morning, got chewed out on the phone by someone. He had lost like $50,000 in some transfer of money. This client of his chewed him out. He got in a fetal position on the floor, sobbing, crying, didn't know what was going on with him, got on a plane, came back to his parents' house, and for several months basically slept in bed and, you know, was a shadow of himself, and came to see me, and I'm seeing him twice a week. And some of these great existential ideas around, you know, emotional breakdown being a form of an emotional breakthrough, and I would use that language with him. The realization that he could no longer pretend that the life that he was living was any life to live, questioning the assumptions that he growing up with, being alienated from his internal desire, always wanting to please, be nice, do the right thing, do right by other people, questioning all of this. I could get into greater detail about that, but he and being in his presence as he's falling apart, and him panicking about him not knowing himself, who has he become, what will he become, will he remain with his fiancée, will he not, what will tomorrow look like, and being able to hang in there with that level of panic, not just anxiety, carrying the confidence for a future self that he has not discovered yet, I think takes great, great, great patience courage on the part of the therapist, but I think is integral to good therapy. I will get into this more tomorrow. I keep saying that. Now I feel like you're trying to sell me on a workshop. I am trying to say talk therapy. So some of these existential ideas are wonderfully practical. So psychotherapy, I think, is an important culturally sanctioned, safe place to go to regress, because when we regress in the real world, we risk really compromising our work and love lives. So extrapolating from the words of the controversial 60s philosophical guru, Alan Watts, psychotherapy ought to be a safe zone that allows us to go out of our mind and come to our senses. And the more we come to our senses, the more sensible we become. Put differently, the psychotherapy experience ought to allow us to go temporarily mad in ways that make us more permanently sane. Otherwise, as Michael Eichen, who's, if you're not familiar with who he is, you should read some of his books. The prosaic psychoanalyst asserts, flight from madness reinforces an overly defensive or even sick sanity. And I wonder, in this push towards evidence-based treatments, where there's a dismissiveness of regressive kinds of experience, if what we're doing is really foreclosing many clients' opportunities to truly reinvent themselves, to truly reacquaint themselves with anything that resembles a real self. And I think there's profound ethical ramifications to all of that. Psychotherapy, as I argue in the book, good psychotherapy of the sort that I'm delineating, has implications for the health of an advanced democracy. I make the point that psychotherapy is a social corrective to the empathy deficit in our culture, which perpetuates divisiveness through eroding the capacity to emotionally identify with others, so as to care for their rights in any fundamental way. Psychotherapy sensitizes people. It better positions them psychologically to feel at one with others, to feel the me in you and the you in me, which is the basis for reciprocal human rights advocacy. I assert that psychotherapy is perhaps unique and unmatched as a cultural space for the acquisition of an authentic self, the ability to truly think, feel, and act like an individual. The psychosocial conditions for fascism are ripe when too many citizens in a society relinquish freedom, adopt a compliant self, and think, feel, and act in compliance with how mainstream society prescribes that they think, feel, and act, believing they're individuals when in actuality they are clones of each other. Too many people living life as if they were the agent of someone else's intentions can be easily manipulated in actuality by someone else's propagandistic, could you say that word for me, please?
Propagandistic.
Intentions. Good psychotherapy helps people reclaim their subjective voice, feeling, thinking, and acting from a locus of real selfhood, being able to think with as well as against tradition, to authoritatively challenge authoritarian authority. So I think good psychotherapy also helps address the narcissistic vulnerabilities and self-esteem regulation issues that are really at the heart of the tendency or the predisposition to overvalue extrinsic sources of happiness, wealth, status, popularity, vanity. Good psychotherapy really is imbued with and privileges intrinsic sources of happiness, spending quality time with family and loved ones, pursuing enjoyment as an end in itself, music, art, satisfying our basic needs, travel, good food, things like that. This is what people who are in good psychotherapy tend to return to as valuable. So I'm going to end here, shifting gears some. I think that all that I've presented and will discuss tomorrow has implications for the optimal training and education of psychotherapists. Absurdly and sadly, it would appear that the current zeitgeist is such that many psychotherapists have to overcome their education and training to de-educate and untrain themselves simply to sit with and be present to comprehend and be potentially of help to suffering others. I remember many years ago when I was living in Seattle, they had these great lecture series at the University of Washington. I'm forgetting the guy's name, or the journal, and existential. Yes. And he brought in all of these big hitters in the existential tradition. One of whom was R.D. Laing, a countryman of my own. If you haven't yet picked up yet, I'm from Scotland originally, and the great Glaswegian psychiatrist R.D. Laing, I remember, he said while at the University of Washington, this very same thing in a Scottish accent. He said, it is something like, it's just, frankly, it's unacceptable and deplorable that people have to de-educate themselves just to be able to sit there and listen to someone who's in pain. And I believe that very same thing. It's as maybe truer now, sadly, than it was back then. The program at Seattle U is an exception. It is like a diamond in the rough. I'm embarrassed to admit that many decades ago, ideas like being present with clients seemed soft and vague to me. Now I realize the exquisite sensitivity and relational sophistication associated with truly being present with clients. In fact, it irks me that the new wave in psychoanalytically informed research represent, and even some of this mindfulness stuff out there, but particularly in the psychoanalytic tradition, like with the Boston Change Process Study group, scholars like Daniel Stern, all this talk about moments of meeting, implicit relational knowing, being in the moment with clients. It irks me that there's no credit given whatsoever to those in the existential tradition like Buber or Merleau-Ponty, who were pioneers in these areas that I was exposed to many, many years ago. I'm also embarrassed to admit that when I was a young man here gearing up to apply to doctoral programs in clinical psychology, I cringed over George's course title, The Phenomenology of the Face, believing that once admissions personnel perused my transcripts from Seattle U and eyeballed this course title, I'd be kicked to the curb. Now, as those of you who will attend my workshop tomorrow will learn, George's course title and its implications are profound and a welcome antidote to the impersonal, technocratic, cognitivistic, left-brain dominated, directive, wordy forms of psychotherapy saturating the field at present. In short, the program at Seattle U is vital, and I mean this, to preserving humanistically oriented, in-depth psychotherapy at a time when it is under threat. And I hope my talk tonight and my workshop tomorrow will galvanize and revive students and faculty's appreciation for the program, stoke and rekindle the healthy pride that can be readily derived from being associated with this program as graduates, future graduates, or faculty members, where being associated with the program is truly a badge of honor. And I'm going to end there. Comments, questions, they can be respectful, disrespectful, they can be in line with what I'm talking about, they can challenge it. Yes, George.
Enrico, as I've taught for many years, and I ran into both graduates and undergraduates, when they get a little taste of what we're doing here. Everybody says, God, why didn't I hear this before? And it's like, it makes so much sense. It's almost like natural. And yet, at the same time, it isn't spreading.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been upset at that for years and years and years. I thought when I first applied to Duquesne, I thought, God, this is just going to take off across the country like wildfire. Well, here I am always 40 years later.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's CLU,
Mm-hmm.
Duquesne, and a handful of others. There's individual people out there who do good work.
I think as I see it, looking at my own evolution as a therapist and people that I come into contact with, it gets back to what I said about STEAM, that I think tragically, the therapists need to get further and further and further and further away from the accountability systems that exist in the average graduate school or what's emphasized, to feel more and more accountable to clients and what they want, what they need, and that there's almost like a humanistic evolution that occurs in the field for pragmatic, ethical reasons, because clients want to be listened to on their terms. They want. If you look at in my book, I talk about how Rogers and Kohut both came to the realization that empathy was central to the psychotherapeutic enterprise, and it was essentially clients who called them out, who just said, shut up and listen, essentially. And I think there's a shut up and listen effect that happens over time. Tragically, it's not what's emphasized in graduate school, but it kind of gets instilled and kind of infused into the practice over time, because we're accountable to clients and their betterment. It's also, I mean, the reason I'm writing these papers right now, I think it's so, I'm actually outraged that it took me many, many, many years to be just more transparent with clients, to just be sort of a normal, personable, human person. I mean, it took years, and I've come through Seattle U, I came through Columbia, and just all that, the kind of conscience that implants itself, like be neutral, don't give advice, there's all these prescriptions that get lodged in you that you have to sort of outgrow and overcome, right? And to me, there's something tragic about that, and something kind of, now we're in the world of ethics, too. Yeah. Randy?
Just kind of following up on that, you talk about the sphere that you have, that good psychotherapy is dying out and becoming more and more rare and under threat and pressure kind of in the professional field of mental health counseling, psychotherapy, clinical psychology. But I wonder if not, if there's really any danger of that. There's a danger of it happening in a circumscribed way in the professional kind of arena that's defined as clinical mental health practitioners and therapists. But what you're talking about good therapy is just, it's a good human relationship, and it's everybody's experience of confronting distress, pain, loss, deep confusion, and our experiences of being with others and finding help and support and compassion in the context of a rich relationship. And it happens in all kinds of parts of our lives. And I don't feel like it's in danger of kind of dying in our society or in human beings in general. It's maybe just that it's becoming increasingly scarce and difficult to place it at the center of a psychotherapy training program or a clinical
You don't
program.
find that a little absurd?
Yeah, I mean, it's totally absurd. But you have to almost like kind of like open your eyes and kind of strip away the idea that we're looking for. What we're looking for has to be psychotherapy. If you ask more deeply of yourself and of the people that you're intimate and care about, where do they find kind of healing and growth and an opportunity to bring themselves fully to their experience and to their relationships with others? And you'll hear that it's in relationships with their rabbi, with an osteopath, path, with somebody who's doing wellness work, with somebody who's teaching dance at a community college.
See, but I would counter it, and I think that the availability of sustained empathy is unmatched in other relationships. I mean, I think that access to someone who's devoted to your subjective experience, tracking, matching, exquisitely attuned, showing great discipline in terms of regulating their own responses in the room, being there in that way in a sustained, enduring fashion, I think is unique to psychotherapy. There's aspects, I think, of that in a healthy marriage or in healthy relationships, but I think it's a big ask to ask of others in our normal life. And that's what I mean by regression. Where good psychotherapy, I think, always involves some sort of regressive experience where what aspects of the self, more primal, more primitive, kind of aspects of the self that get expression, or get the light of day, and that you have someone there who's exquisitely attentive and devotedly attentive to that process. I don't know that that's matched in the real world.
I can think of some settings and traditions where I think it is. It's cast in slightly different kind of metaphysics and language, but you're right. I do kind of understand what you're saying. It's extremely rare.
Yeah, thank you. I've just been thinking about how one trend that I've noticed when it comes to deep listening and presence and sitting with someone, there seems to be a trend in the business world and in the idea of leadership, and I see it in kind of like personal coaching as well. This idea of sitting with someone and helping them sort through their goals and their wants, and imagining new possibilities. So it's sort of, I see it as sort of like half of the equation, but there's not a lot of shadow work, or there's not a lot of, what I've heard is that the difference between coaching and therapy is that coaching looks at the future and therapy is just wallowing in the past. Or that's what I hear from the people who do coaching. And I just, I think that there's a fine balance there. But it does concern me that all the good stuff that I hear, all the good stuff coming from other disciplines and areas, there seems to be this idea that if you just focus on the future and on goals, that you've done it. But there's not room for that sort of regressive experience of being in the darkness and being in what is not what is ugly and not fun. So I think that I on the one hand see it being pretty exciting, some of the stuff that's going on in other disciplines, and I think using some of the threads of psychotherapy, or the goals, the aspirations of psychotherapy, creating, helping people become more engaged and more informed and more autonomous. But there's a danger in educating, somebody building agency without examining what's underneath all the shadow work. That's I think actually quite dangerous. Awareness can be a double-edged sword.
Maybe what you and Randy are saying is that psychotherapy is sort of, not terribly dissimilar from how good relationships, transpire. And I'm in perfect agreement with that. I mean, I think that psychotherapy is just a more concentrated version of it, yet not something that's categorically different. in the medicalized sense. So that's one sort of response. Another response would be that maybe this focus on mindfulness in our culture right now is part of what's happening in kind of executive coaching and whatnot. That being present to your own thoughts and feelings, just allowing them to occur without judgment, and, and sitting with them and containing them. There's value in that, and that extends beyond the consulting room and into, therapists, into the sort of the business world and whatnot. I'm not a big fan of mindfulness, at least the cognitive version of it. Yeah. Claire?
Thank you. I feel like in some ways we're a bit of the choir and what it's like to meet folks who are seeing this as it's not meant.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like, because we were taught the personal and the professional are not separate.
Mm-hmm.
And that it is the person of the therapist
Mm-hmm.
that is as pivotal
Mm-hmm.
to the process of therapy as it is the client.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not, at some level, that's delving into the spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
And so the crisis and the crises that we face now, especially with the burden of being in this day and age, and what we do with that, is, maybe in previous ages there used to be a shaman that lived on the outside of town.
Mm-hmm.
Could come in for weddings and funerals and healings and then leave.
Mm-hmm.
But what place do we have in this
Mhm.
world, in this life, in this age, if we are to be at the level of I mean, it's like for you, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that, well, I mean, the notion that that there are members of society always have been, who play the role that we call it psychotherapists now. We used to call them shamans and whatnot, that step in and allow for kind of transformative experiences. I think that that's a noble idea. I mean, I think that but I still want to retrench some. Still want to kind of get back to Freud. Still want to get back to Rogers. Still want to get back to Rollo May. Still want to distill this thing called psychotherapy as valuable and needing preserving. Yeah.
How do you think that happens, though, like with all the forces that exist here? I mean, idealistically, this is all lovely, and I'm totally on board with it, and it like rejuvenates something within me. Yet I lived in the UK and did my initial training in the UK for counseling, and I remember in 2012 I was at a debate at the Maudsley, and it was this very thing that was CBT versus psychoanalysis. And I had a placement in the psychoanalytic department of King's College Hospital, and they closed it because they were taking on the American model of CBT and cost effectiveness. So it's like, I get it a lot from this, yet it feels like the marketing campaign in the United States overrides everything, everywhere. And so where's the change?
Well, I think there's political battles that need to happen in the field, which I'm part of right now, where there's an abundance of research out there actually verifying and substantiating humanistic models of care that just don't get the kind of press that they deserve. I mean, there's common factors research, contextual factors research showing that the personhood of the therapist, Claire, and is far more predictive of outcome in psychotherapy than techniques. Empathy, rapport building, genuineness on the part of the therapist. That research actually is far more, there's a far more larger body of evidence supporting those notions. It just doesn't get pressed. And part of it is because of the hegemonic forces in the field right now. There's like a monoculture of ideas in the field of psychology right now. Stanley Macer out of Rutgers University did a study and showed that the pluralism in the field right now is under threat. About 80% of faculty self-identify as cognitive behavioral, and they're the gatekeepers in the profession. They basically dictate what constitutes adequate training, and you know, so it's really a political issue, and there's a need, and it's kind of vicious. I mean, I was interviewed on Boston, WBUR in Boston earlier in the year. Well, I kind of got hijacked. I was in a little studio in Culver City with, about 7 o'clock in the morning with a set of headphones on. It was live out of Boston, going out all over Boston. When my book came out, and they pitted me against a professor, I won't name his name, you can listen to the radio interviews online, who headed up the anxiety disorder clinic at Boston University. And he and I went at it over the air. He basically, at one point, we were arguing about empathy and what constitutes empathy, and he was saying, you've got it all wrong. Cognitive behavioral therapy, respects empathy in the therapeutic process. And I said something to him like, there is a difference between sustained empathy is integral to the practice of psychotherapy and momentary dollops of empathy that you show a client as you're kind of deploying your techniques. And we were just like, "Arr." And so I think that there's just political wars that need to be fought, and we just need to keep emphasizing and reintroducing the research that exists out there that is high quality research that basically reinforces everything that's going on at Seattle U. Empirical data.
Well, to her issue, which I think is a very important issue, is what happens when all of this is going around us and political venues says, people are moving fast, they want to quit, they want to get in, they want to get out. I think a very important piece are the professors. And colleges like Seattle U, certainly UW, where I went,